when we're talking about liberation. I think a lot of people don't spend enough time with what's on the other side because we're afraid, because we don't know, because it feels so deeply unknown what would be on the other side of revolution that we refuse to actually project ourselves into there. But the way in which you get a better idea of what's on the other side of revolution is by building it now.
Well, hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to In the Meanwhile. I'm Marcus Harrison Green.
And I'm Nora Kenworthy. Marcus, I'm going to be transparent with our listeners today. Well, as always. Normally, we'd give you a recap of the week in politics, but honestly, it's the same reheated nonsense from last week, just epically larger portions.
Yeah, this is like Costco size or something, Nora. I don't know. America's political kitchen is basically a microwave set permanently to chaos and incompetence these days. And while we know you sometimes come to us to break down the news and our unfiltered opinions, we also know that sometimes what people really need is a small break from the endless doom scroll buffet.
Exactly. So today we wanted to do something a little bit different, something that we hope will actually be useful. A lot of people right now are asking a very real question. How do we stay in this work of trying to make things better without losing our minds?
Yeah, especially because a lot of folks are new to this work, whether that's activism, organizing, or just trying to live with some kind of moral compass after the 2024 election.
Yeah. And if you're new to this work, one thing you may have quickly already learned: this work is messy. It is inspiring and full of wonderful people, but it's also painful and complicated. And it occasionally makes you want to throw your phone into the nearest body of water.
That is a great, I would say that's a great definition of life as well, Nora. But anyhow, but I will say that is why we were really struck by a recent essay from Seattle-based writer, speaker, and professional truth teller Ijeoma Oluo on her Substack Behind the Book. The essay is titled "If You Decide to Stay."
And it's about something that people really don't talk about enough: the emotional and personal costs of doing this work, and also what it means to actually choose to stay in it anyways.
And yes, even though reading has tragically gone out of style in certain corners of American life, Nora and I do still do it occasionally.
That's
So,
radical, I know.
yeah. But this essay, y'all, it's powerful, it's vulnerable, and honestly, it's kind of required reading, I'd say, if you care about justice movements or just trying to survive this political moment with your humanity intact.
Which is kind of what this entire podcast is about. So,
Yeah.
we're trying very hard not to completely glaze Ijoma too much in this interview.
We
But
really did try.
it was hard not
Yes.
to. It's really hard to do when someone's work has shaped how so many people think about race and justice and collective action.
Exactly, Nora. So, we'll keep the glazing to a respectable minimum. But unlike Travis Kelsey talking about Taylor Swift on his podcast, we just this is deserving. This is actually
This is
deserving.
absolutely deserving.
So, without farther ado, here's our conversation with Seattle-based writer, speaker, and internet yeller, Ijeoma Oluo, author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, So You Want to Talk About Race, the critically acclaimed Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America, and Be a Revolution, How Everyday People Are Fighting Oppression and Changing the World, and How You Can Too. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Guardian, Esquire, and Elle, and she's been featured everywhere from The Daily Show to NPR to the BBC. She's also been named one of Seattle's most influential voices, a Time 100 Next honoree, and one of the most important public thinkers writing about race and justice today.
She's a true celeb. And I absolutely fangirled during this interview.
And honestly, listeners, you should too.
Here's our conversation with Ijeoma Oluo.
Ijeoma, thank you again just for being here today with us to discuss your exquisite essay. I hope that our listeners have read it, and if not, they need to stop right now and then go read it and then come back to this conversation. But I want to say you opened this essay by saying you didn't choose this work and that it began with the murder of Trayvon Martin and the feeling that you would go crazy, quote unquote, if you didn't speak. Uh, Looking back more than a decade later, what did that moment unlock in you that hadn't existed before?
I think, what it highlighted for me was first and foremost the limits of liberal empathy. And it kind of created that crisis point of, people in Seattle have the right things to say often, and recognizing, oh, you literally never thought you were going to have to deal with this in your life. Like white Seattle in particular, non-black Seattle in particular, realizing in that moment, in such a different reaction of how real this was to me, how much genuine, justified fear and outrage and anger and hurt this brought to me for my family, for all the Black people I love. Um, and then watching the stark difference in how it impacted other people, and the refusal of people to talk about it in a real concrete way. It really helped me understand, at first it really confused me. And when I talk about, like, I didn't want to go crazy, I'm not lying. I remember calling people and saying, like, am I crazy? Like, I'm surrounded by people who are just going about their day. Like, this doesn't matter. Like, it's a, sad television show they watched and not something real, and that was, when I first started writing, it was really about trying desperately to get people to understand why we needed to engage with this. And it was really local. Like, I remember writing and thinking, I had people in mind. I had names in mind of people in my life that I really like wanted to understand this. And that's kind of where that came from, was, what if I tried this? What if I tried this? What if I tried this? And it was just kind of this desperation. I remember at the time as well, my brother Ahamefle was on tour and had already, like, been in a physical altercation on tour, had already been handcuffed on tour. And I remember feeling deeply afraid for them, and just not understanding why people couldn't get that, why it mattered. There was such a dismissal of the real genuine fear and outrage that people felt for their own people. It was acceptable to be sad for Trayvon. It was acceptable to be mad about what happened to this child. But it was viewed unacceptable to then say, we need to talk about how this could be me, this could be my children, this could be my siblings. That was deemed unacceptable, because then that brought in the reality that, there were people in our community who would do that sort of harm. And so that's kind of where it all started for me.
Thank you. And of course, your writing has had such a tremendous impact on the conversations that so many of us have had about race and racism in the United States. My understanding is that a lot of that work has also come with very distinct threats and harassment and violence. Doing this work as a Black woman in particular exposes you to a very particular kind of hate, I think. How have you come to measure the cost of speaking out and writing and continuing to write for survival, oftentimes, when the personal risk is so real?
I think, what I've had to learn over the years is that if you're a Black woman in the United States and you take up any space, there's a cost. And it doesn't matter what you're taking that space for. You could absolutely be carrying water for white supremacy, and there's still going to be a real cost, not only to your, like, soul, but you will be made to pay for taking any space in this country. And part of how that shows in response to my work is it's almost never about my actual work. When we were swatted in 2019, it was really interesting to look at the website that was, basically enticing people to SWAT us, because they were pulling quotes and putting them on this website, because it didn't matter. None of the people doing this had any idea what my work was, cared what my work was. I've been harassed over the most seemingly innocuous things. I've been threatened over, very innocuous things in my life. And It's just about taking up space. So if that's the risk, what you take up space for, I think that matters to me, at least. If it's gonna cost me no matter what, I might as well go down swinging. And that's kind of the thing I have to remind myself. And there are times where I am incredibly afraid. um my partner Gabriel reminds me regularly, it's not my work that does this, it's the response, right? My work doesn't make me unsafe. White supremacy makes me unsafe. And just like it made Trayvon Martin unsafe, just like it killed him for simply walking down the street. And so remembering that I didn't get into this work because I was safe and I risked my safety. I got into this work because I wasn't safe. And, I'm fighting for our lives. I don't know what other choice I have. I don't know how to not do this.
One of the things you write about or touch on in the essay is that many activists is something that many activists don't say publicly, but certainly feel, and that's that sometimes the deepest wounds come not from opponents, but from people inside the movement. When we bring our worst selves home to each other. So, why do you think movements that are fighting injustice can still produce such a painful internal conflict at times?
I would say that's the case more often than not for people. When I talk to people who leave, it's the number one reason why they leave the work, why they stop doing it. Because there is a special kind of pain. We know, that we're not safe out in the world, but feeling also then unsafe in community who knows how to hurt you uniquely, is another layer onto it that can really become untenable. And I think there's so many reasons around why. Um, One is, I've said before, we're traumatized people doing traumatizing work in traumatized community in a system that refuses to acknowledge our trauma. And we are collectively very under resourced. I had to search for well over a year to find a Black therapist. It's and the privilege of being able to afford that is, another layer on top of that. And so, we're coming into these spaces that are activating us even further. And we are under resourced. We do not have time to build a lot of tools, or we think we don't have time to build a lot of tools around this. And then we live in a carceral society. And the ways in which a carceral society impacts the way in which we deal with conflict, we often don't investigate. It's easy to be externally focused in activism work, even in abolitionist activism work, and to ignore all of the ways in which carceral um, training has really been, inserted into our lives. And when we think about the way in which, even in our communities, we define parenting, we define, getting in an argument with your loved ones, so much carceral messaging goes along with that. And so it's no wonder that, when we're stressed and we're running off instinct, that instinct is going to go towards more carceral thinking. And then there's other layers, right? There are mental health challenges that can make it very hard. There is a lack of analysis that often makes it into our activist groups. We have people who are very activated by something, but perhaps don't have the deep theory that can help them really apply these ideas and terms into how we operate. And then we have, of course, like COINTELPRO, we have very active efforts to exacerbate these sort of conflicts. And it makes it very tough, to go through these things. We don't have strong histories, I would say, especially in places like Seattle, where there have been the purposeful discouragement of multi generational movement work. We don't have a long history of learning the real cost of not knowing how to work through conflict, not knowing, how to make agreements on how we treat each other and care about each other. And so instead, what ends up happening is generation after generation gets pushed out. And then we start from scratch over and over again. And that is really tough. It's not only does it take an immense personal toll on individual movement workers, but it is a devastating toll on the movement itself and what we're able to accomplish.
Yeah, thank you for just laying that out so clearly. I think it echoes a lot of themes that we also talked about with Dean Spade last year. about his book, Love in a Fucked Up World, which is the sort of relational angle of a lot of this movement work as well. Several years ago, you write in this piece about how you faced intense backlash upon the publication of your latest book, Be a Revolution. And you write about how much that conflict impacted you and your work and your way of thinking about how you relate to movements. I guess I'm also wondering if you can talk to us about whether it also impacted how you think about your writing as a core part of movement work, and how you kind of found your way back to writing, or wrote through it, if that's fair.
Yeah, I would say, one of the things that was really heartbreaking about this, and I'm not going to go into detail about it because I try not to, was I think that this book was a time where I actually, in the process of writing it, was able to really more clearly than ever see my work in movement spaces. And to have then that same work be really deliberately misconstrued and used, weaponized, was very hurtful, and it really shook me to my core, and it really damaged my relationship with writing in general. And that was really tough for me. And I couldn't write for a long time. I was really afraid. I was really in the thick of it. I think also, too, being a neurodivergent person, writing has been my best way of communicating with people. It has been a way to break down a lot of barriers that I've had throughout my entire life in being able to feel heard and understood. And so this was an incredibly personally painful thing. And it made the one like really safe place I had in my life feel incredibly unsafe. And because, going through this, when you're subjected to like campaigns like this, I also knew my work was being watched incredibly closely. And everything I wrote, whether I'm talking about my day, seemed to be used against me, because that's what the internet does, right? Like it rewards this. And I will say there's also this aspect of when you're in community that is deeply harmed and can often feel very powerless against systems that are causing harm. When you're offered up a target, when you're offered up a target that is reachable, a lot of people grab for that. And so it very much felt like this was my turn to be grabbed for. And I really couldn't write. And that, and, I was already, I think, entering this project feeling incredibly burned out by the capitalist nature of the publishing industry itself. Like I was already feeling very much like this was going to be my last nonfiction book for a long time because I was already on the verge of it. And so then to have this happen, it was like a perfect storm. Um, and in some ways, now looking back at it, it could have happened at any time. When I finally, the few times I've spoken about it, every time I have heard from other writers who have had the exact same thing happen to them. And it was heartbreaking actually to hear about how many of them to this day do not write anymore because of it. So I'm glad to have moved through it. It took a lot, and it still hurts. It's still tough. It still um, increases my anxiety to still honestly be targeted. But it's something, that I've had to deal with my therapist saying, you know what, you may have to make peace with the fact that um, this could happen the rest of your life. That you could wake up every day the rest of your life, and there will be people who want the worst for you in your community. What are you going to do if nothing you do can change that? And that's been the thing I've been grappling with, because if I can't change it, then, what am I going to let it take from me? And that's the question that, I've had to ask. And so it's been a long process. First, I think of kind of getting myself into a more centered space, um, building up more tools to be able to understand what happened to the degree that I can, to invest in healthier relationships, and to give myself, a better ability to withstand these sorts of things before I felt like I could start writing again. And
Hmm.
it's really only been in recent months that I felt like I could.
I mean, this says so much about our movement spaces, that your level of acceptance is like, I might just have to accept that this happens to me every single day when I wake up in the morning for the rest of my life, rather than there is space for amends, and there's space for healing, and there's space to find a way back to belonging. And of course, that's the center of our movements because that's what we all want to give each other. Like, how has it changed the way that you think about movement spaces?
I I wouldn't say it's actually changed all that much, because I think the thing that we always forget about this is consent matters. And people have to consent to a process, right? So I can live up to my values. I can offer up resolution. I can reach out and say, can we talk about this? Can we work this out? And at the end of the day, people have the right to say no. And they have the right to say, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And I think what it underscored for me was that community actually needs to know what to do with that. Community needs to have collective ideas of what is and isn't acceptable and what they will do, instead of, because it wasn't, one individual doesn't have the power to do this to me. It's community response that does. And that's honestly, at the end of the day, if I ever got any, when you dream of like having that like real come to Jesus conversation where you're like, how dare you? I don't want that for community. You know what I mean? Um, Not like a person who's fixated on me. I want that for community that fed that, that used it to, try to appease something within themselves. I want us to be able to work through these things to minimize harm, and to have more collective responsibility of how we move through things. So it didn't, at first it just made, for me, it was a very personal idea of, I don't know how to be safe, you know? Um, and that's hard. And being neurodivergent, it is hard for me because I do take a lot of people at their word, you know? I take what people say about me at their word. And it was so hard for me to wrap my heads around that there can be people in movement spaces who do not have the best intentions, or for some reason will not humanize.
Well, I will say, since you do take things to heart that people say on this podcast, we believe you are the greatest living thinker and writer right now in the game today. So, to put a fine bow on the book, I will say that it was recently named the Washington State Book. It recently got the Washington State Book Award for best nonfiction book. So, congratulations! I also happen to be one of the judges on there, but whatever. Anyhow, that being said, like there's been so often, so many times where y- I know people look at you as a model of somebody who has maintained their principles even in the face of so much that has gone on, right? I, I know you don't like to. I know you're fairly modest in terms of you don't like to be some of the things you do to be stated publicly that you do for other people. But I will say, like I run Hinton Publishing. It's a book publishing company that focuses on, as we say, underinvited, people to the publishing industry. We had lost an investment because we signed on to a letter about the genocide that's going on in Gaza. And I was a very prideful person. I don't like to ask for help, but it came down to the wire, and I spoke to you, and you replaced that investment. And so I just want to ask you how do you manage to sort of maintain your stances, maintain your principles, even in this world and society that continues to be immoral, continues to be um, a place where folks, sort of sell out as easy as they can at times, and still at the end of the day, I mean, you are who you were 10 years ago in terms of how you move forward in life.
I think it's just who I am. I think it's part of why I became a writer. I I've always actually been really confused by people who don't, especially when I can't find a good reason. I think that's actually part of what I've had to reckon with in everything that I've gone through these last few years is, as my therapist says, it's like when you're driving and you have that blind spot on your car you can't see. There are behaviors that people have that fit in that just don't make sense to me. And one of them is like how you sleep at night, not being consistent, not living up to your morals. These are things I do for me. At the end of the day, I have to live with myself. And I just can't imagine what it would take to get me to violate that. And I don't understand, I expect there's some level of harm that makes people do that. And I say that because I'm a parent. And if you've ever cared for young children, they they have that sense of justice, innate justice in them, right? Things are fair or unfair. And you know, things are true or not. And then they experiment with other things as society tells them to try other things out. And we are really pressured into leaving that and traumatized into leaving our primary sense of justice and fairness. And I guess I'm just stubborn. And so I see it more as a symptom of harm often in people who do this. And it doesn't mean that they're not personally responsible for the choices they make. But just like I hope community can take community responsibility, I also think we have to look collectively at our society in the way in which it divorces people from their ethics and from, I think, the innate human need to stay, connected and to care for each other. And so it's just kind of it's just who I am and how I live, and I don't know how to move elsewhere. And I will say it has served me, you know. Um, I may not get these moments of like comeuppance, you know. I may not get like justice in the sense that so many people think is, which isn't justice, right? It's punishment. Um, but there's no level of care that I have given to community that hasn't been paid back to me tenfold at all. You know, like I am so rich in that. And especially at times like this, when we're feeling so unsafe and scared, and society is pushing us into these individualistic spaces. Um, I'm so fortunate to have a sense of home in that, in that community. And that can't be taken from me. It
Hmm.
just can't. And so, it is something I do for myself before anything else.
Yeah. The thing that I just find really magical about this essay and just the piece of it that I want to keep reading like every morning before I go to work is about how you took this um, experience of like profound harm and rather than choosing revenge or isolation, really made this very conscious decision to choose to move back into activism and also to choose to do it with an ethic of love. And I think what bell hooks would probably refer to as like love work, right? Um, that's such a hard decision, and it's actually such a rare decision in our culture that just rewards this kind of punishment and carceral kind of system. What helped you find that path?
Part of it was I've been watching people on the internet for a long time. I've been watching what happens to people when they are accused of harm, called out for harm, whether they did it or not, right? And their responses to it. And I was always mystified by the double down, by the attack, by the way in which people, because I remember always saying, like, you can just say, hey, I fucked up, you know, hey, I'm sorry, right? Um, and watching how that can shift people and pull them away from what they believed in always felt really sad to me. And I never understood it until I realized that sometimes even trying to do, reach out, trying to have conversations, trying to do that doesn't work. And then you feel so deeply unsafe and you feel so attacked. And the moment I thought to myself, I could never work with someone again, the amount of alarm bells that went off in my head where I was like, oh, this is how it happens. This is how it happens. This is how you find yourself outside of this. And I didn't want that. I really didn't want that. I never like saw that working out for people. I never saw it actually bring people peace. When I talk to people where it did force them out, and I'm not blaming them. I could talk to them a decade after it happened, and it's still as fresh and raw because every day they know what it took from them. And I didn't want that. And I'm stubborn. I'm so stubborn. Um, and so I just was like, I have to find a way to fight this. And by fight this, it wasn't about fighting what people were saying about me, fighting like the attacks. It was fighting my urge to think that safety ever lied in isolation and seclusion. But it also meant that I had to address the real issues around my safety and start taking that really seriously as well. And so, that was really that moment, like saying that and realizing, oh crap, I'm in danger here. I'm in danger of actually leaving this work that really matters behind if I don't figure out how to move through this.
Well, you talk sort of about how, the isolation and alienation that some people feel. And I was recently talking to someone for a story, and she's somebody who has lived in Seattle around the time of CHOP, and she had a family tragedy happen. She felt that sh she felt that, uh, folks weren't there for her, and, and there was no place to go to in terms of a bedrock foundation of love and belonging. And, she ended up and is still now a, Uber, MAGA, person, and, but is, seemingly coming down from that. And one of the things we discussed is she said, I it and not to discount her own agency in a situation, but she was saying, what I've realized was I do wonder if there had been just a community of belonging for me, if maybe I would have chosen a different path. And so I want to ask you, particularly in this time that we live in now, how, how do how do activist spaces and movement spaces, how can we go about creating um I don't know, that bedrock of, yeah, yeah, of course we all believe in accountability and so forth, and and calling people into their integrity, but also how do we create a space where folks can, come and be restored and redeemed, and ultimately, and also just human, just messily human.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I'm grappling with. I know a lot of my peers are grappling with. I think we've all been through the ringer these last few years around this, and it's true what the person you were talking about was saying. Yes, personal responsibility has something to do with it, but honestly, in these fascist far right spaces, all you have to do is promise you're never going to apologize, and you're in. That's all you have to do, and you're not going to be cast out because they've gotten that every number they get helps. And we can't operate necessarily in that way because it does put people within at risk. But I do think it's important to understand that's what we're up against. And that's why, people used to always think that white supremacists would die out. And that's not true because we have young people who need connection so deeply and they're not finding it in our spaces. And they're not finding it because we don't know how to do it. Um, because so much of the way in which we talk about movement work, we use the same language for systems that we use for people in our communities, and that has to stop. We cannot treat people in our communities like they are the boot on our neck. They're not. And we have to have grace and empathy even when it hurts, even when people are doing harm. We have to always have a community focus when it comes towards repairing harm and accountability for harm. And we always have to remember that accountability is a relationship. And so I think investigating our relationship to carceral culture is so vital. Having basic agreements of how we're going to treat each other. I host monthly abolitionist community meetups. And the first thing we started with were agreements on what we were going to do. And I always tell people, if you have any say in designing spaces around movement work, assume everyone's coming in on the worst day. Assume everyone's bringing their worst selves. What can you do in how you design the space and the agreements you make with each other to mitigate harm that can do, right? And at best, help people grow through that process. But that is care that oftentimes people think we don't have time for because we're always in a state of emergency. And I hate to say it, we're going to be in a state of emergency our whole lives. And so, if not now, when? What is it going to cost us before we realize that this is something we have to focus on? And so a lot of that really means being more strategic, looking at who has what role in spaces. If you come up to me and you say something that directly harms me, it's not my responsibility to educate you through that, but it should be someone's,
Mhm.
right? And knowing how we do that, what agreements we're going to go through in that. learning these practices that honestly people have spent so much time designing, and like trying to educate us about, and prioritizing them is really, really, really important, and it can't be skipped. And the more, honestly, under attack we feel, the more important it is, because we do not, I don't think people fully get, when you feel under attack, whether that's physical attack, emotional attack, mental attack, right? Your fight or flight kicks in, and you are not capable of that kind of higher thinking. You are not able to be like, let me observe the texts. What kicks in is you're going to fight or you're going to run away, right? Um, and knowing that that happens, not just when we are up against a system, but also when someone says something to you that, makes you feel unsafe, or when someone comes to you and says you did something makes you made them feel unsafe. Knowing that that's what's going to kick in means you have to build the safeguards around that so that it can act in place of your own higher thinking, whether that's people stepping in, whether that's someone to remind you that you made a different agreement, whether that's a process that takes over. Understanding that is so, so crucial to how we do this work. Um, and so, and having agreements of what support actually looks like, I think is also huge. We have to move away from this idea that support looks like joining a fight against someone else in your community, you know? And we have to look at, support looks like what is best for the person harmed and community, not necessarily what the person harmed wants in that moment when they're not using that thinking, right? And so that is something that we have to really investigate, and we have to look at the dynamics we're building, take better responsibility for it, and build it now so that we have processes in place that can take over when all the books we read fail us because we're in this totally different space in our heads.
Yeah, and I mean, just to amplify what you're saying, it's also our cycle into that flight or flight reaction is so much amplified by the fact that so many of us come into this work having experienced trauma and continuing to experience trauma. Um, One of the things that you write about in the articles, you quote Saul Williams saying that not everyone wants to be alive in a time of revolution. And you write a bit about your acceptance and your journey to embracing what it means to live in one anyways. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is my year of consent, honestly. Self consent, which is a thing we don't talk about a lot. I'm a caregiver. Um, Part of it's probably by nature. A lot of it is conditioned, very gendered, eldest daughter conditioning. Um, and for the longest time, my life was defined by what I had to do, including my work, and by who needs me. And never was the thought that I get to choose a thing that I considered. And I think for many of us doing work like that, it's not a thought we have. And this is when I decided to stay and fight, that was a choice I had to make. And realizing I was making a choice brought consent into this. But I'm also practicing it in everything I do, whether it's saying yes to an engagement. I'm not saying yes because, oh, I think this would be good for my career and I have to. I'm I may take that into consideration, but at the end of the day, I have to say to myself, do you consent to this? Am I honestly, with full knowledge, coming in and saying, I choose to do this? And it could be because of pressure, but it's still a choice I'm making. And the shift that makes in how you do things and how you care for yourself around these things is really, really huge. You have to choose this work. Waiting for it to choose you is probably one of the worst outcomes. Choosing it means you get to decide how you move through it. Choosing it means that you choose why you're doing it instead of having to do it. Choosing it is a commitment and a relationship to the work that is equitable instead of, an imbalanced power dynamic. I'm in relationship with the work because I chose the work just like I choose my partner, just like, all of these other things. I'm interacting with the work, I'm in conversation with the work. And I think it's so important that we recognize that when you choose how you move through the world, when you choose the work that you do, you get to negotiate with it. You get to ask more of it. You get to decide how it's defined. And that's a huge difference in a world that tries to define so much about us and tries to tell us we have to do things in this particular way. And it makes it work that you can do for the rest of your life because as what you need changes, you have the ability to change how you do the work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you talk about choosing that work and choosing it again and again, when you talk about revolution, in the essay, yes, but also in your work, you talk about it. At least how I pick it up is that it's a way of living, and not just in moments of crisis, but in the ordinary rhythms of life. And so I want to ask you, what does that look like, just as sort of a culture of revolution in your everyday life? Whether you're at the dinner table, whether you're conversing with somebody, um, I don't know, you're spending money. What does that look like practically to you?
I believe in so many different types of revolution. I believe in the big revolution too, right? I believe in like the everything toppling to the ground. I'm just honestly, I think the work I'm doing is I'm trying to come through revolution the easier way, where you're doing the day-to-day work instead of coming to this point of crisis that can cost a lot. Um and but I believe in both. I'll be there for both. I would rather though, you know, I would rather be here now because even if it does come to the big revolution, the work we do now every day will serve that and it will serve to protect people. And so recognizing that when we're talking about liberation, I think a lot of people don't spend enough time with what's on the other side because we're afraid, because we don't know, because it feels so deeply unknown what would be on the other side of revolution that we refuse to actually project ourselves into there. But the way in which you get a better idea of what's on the other side of revolution is by building it now. And we can't build that on a national level right now. We build it in our families, in our work relationships, in our communities, in our movement spaces. And that means that every choice we make and how we relate to each other and care for each other and ourselves is either in service of revolution or works against it. There is no neutrality, right? Neutrality works against it. Um, and that's a beautiful thing. Like it can seem tough, but honestly, to me, it's amazing to know that every day I have countless opportunities to be in service of revolution. And and that everything I do in service of revolution helps protect my people and helps us get a better idea of what the other side looks like. So for me, where I have the most power, where I can get closer to it is often in my relationships. It's not just in my writing and in my work, but it is how I parent. It is how I deal with conflict with my partner. It's how I, as a business owner, deal with the people I work with. It's how I treat people when they're upset with me or seeking to harm me. All of these things are in service of revolution if you want it to be. And that just means really envisioning what you want this to be on the other side and building that now. And so for me as an abolitionist, that is a very clear like set of principles that helps me kind of experiment within my relationships to see what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, do you at times ever feel like Sisyphus though, like just rolling the boulder up the hill only for it to return? Like, I mean, what is it? Wouldn't it just be easier, right, to I don't know, just go off, sell out to the Democratic Party and be on MS Now all the time? I mean,
Oh, I mean, that's a nightmare for me. Like knowing the level of introvert I am is really, really, really important. I have no desire for fame. I have no desire to be on people's television screen. there are times where I make a choice to be in spaces, but I don't think many people become writers. At least, I mean, I think white men do, but I don't think a lot of people in my community become writers because they want to be famous, and want to be in the limelight. Like it's a very, very, quiet work. Um, I'd be a very different type of writer if that's what I was seeking. I'll say that. And um, what what's there are times where, yeah, it's hard. I'd say in parenting is actually where it's the hardest. There are times where my own son is like, Mom, can you just tell me what to do? I'm tired of negotiate. I don't want to negotiate with this. I don't want to talk about our relationship and our goals. Just tell me what it is you want me to do so I can do it and be done and be mad at you for that. And like, it's good. And I'm trying to teach him how to build his relationships in life, right? And I want, a healthy relationship with my son. And so in many ways it does feel like I'm doing that the hard way, like I'm not stepping in because I said so, do this thing. Everything is a talk and a negotiation. And I am, you know, finding balance between my role as a parent and, someone whose job is to see someone as safely through to adulthood and his autonomy, right? Um, and that can be really tough. And that's, I think, mostly when I feel like, oh, I wish I could just be like, you know, this would be so easy to just be like, because I said so. And it's hard too, because I actually often get judged by that. People will judge you as a parent if you have a kid that you raised to talk back to you. But I did, because I'm not actually trying to raise a perpetual child. I'm trying to raise an adult, and I'm trying to give him the opportunities to learn through childhood what he will need to be as a Black man in this country, which is strong and um, kind and loving and secure in himself and secure in his community and able to build healthy relationships. And you don't get through that by saying, just do what I say. So I have to go through it the hard way. For the rest of my life, I just, it's so itchy to me. Like it itches deeply to live in a way that I don't believe in. Like you have to have faith. I am a devout atheist, but we all have to have faith in something. And this is what I have faith in. And I have faith in humanity. And that's it. And I can't, if I lost that, what would I have? I don't have anything else, honestly, to fall back on. I don't believe in God. So that's it. There's nothing else waiting for me other than what humanity can bring. And I have to have faith in that, or I have faith in nothing. And so, you know, I just, yeah, I choose it. I choose to have that faith. And it's what keeps me going. And within that, yeah, I get hurt, but I would rather be hurt in that way than the alternative of a life without real connection, a life without hope. I would rather be let down over and over and over and over again and wake up and say it could be different this time than to wake up every morning and say it never will be.
Mm. Yeah, I often say that our abolition principles are most tested in the family and parenting realm. I remember when my daughter was 3 and learned to tell me it was her body, her choice at nap time every day. I wish I'd had you around to give me advice then. Um, I wanna lean a little bit more into this place of faith, and talk about the end of the essay where you really write about the particular joy that can arise in choosing to stay and choosing to continue investing in these relationships even in painful times. Um, we really like joy on this podcast, even though it's hard to come by these days. And so, can you articulate a little bit for us what kinds of joy you found in this work, um, and in kind of choosing to double down on it, that people outside of movements might not necessarily understand?
Yeah. When I decided to stay, I had to decide how to design my presence in movement spaces so that I could. And I didn't decide to be a martyr. I didn't decide I'm going to suffer through it. That's not the choice I made. I had to figure out how to be able to stay. Part of the fight is figuring out how to make it work for you. And so for me, a lot of that was deciding to be my whole self. Um, Knowing that I could be as careful as I could think of and still be her, it was kind of freeing in a way, because then it, you know, the alternative is you could also just be yourself. And, at least you didn't hurt yourself in the process. And that meant for me really insisting on getting to know some of the people I was in movement spaces with better and letting them know me better. One, it what actually is a safety issue, right? Getting to really know people instead of just taking them at their word, getting to learn through experiences with them, through understanding more of their lives. And I'm not saying you have to do that with everyone in a space. That would be overwhelming. You can build coalition actually without, friendly relationship. Absolutely. But the people you're doing the day to day work with, knowing them, whether you decide to become friends or not, like is actually really important. And letting them know you is really important. This We're fighting for our communities, and you do have to be in community. And so in doing that, it meant that for me, it was no longer acceptable to only see people at protests. It was no longer acceptable to only see people at actions, or in strategy meetings. If we were going to fight for our lives, we're also going to be able to celebrate our lives. And so I started showing up at people's open mics. I started showing up, and like, birthdays and all these other things that normally I would have said, I don't have time for, or energy for. Instead, I started viewing it as a huge part of the work. And what came through that is a built in reminder of what we're fighting for, not just what we're fighting against. That's a really dark, bleak place to live in. What you're fighting for is the hope and the light and the joy and the love. And so building that, nurturing that, maintaining that has become a huge part of my work. And so I'm lucky, um, not lucky, blessed. I'm really blessed in that I have these relationships that do feel deeply safe, not because they will never have conflict, but because I can be really open in what I need. And I think the people that I'm in relationship with in this work feel the same about me, and that we have made some agreements, in how we're going to work through things and talk through things. And we have a shared vision of the future we're fighting for. We have a shared joy that we're fighting to protect. I'm And in that, it also means that as someone who is very neurodivergent and someone who does need a lot of alone time and downtime from social things, I'm also able to protect that in the work. So I'm able to say things like, I can't do all of these things and I will be gone for a while. Or, they know now to say, oh, you showed up tonight. I know not to expect you tomorrow. I know that you're going to need that break, and it isn't a thing, and it isn't a big deal. And knowing, that you're cared for in that way and seen in that way, and that people understand that you taking that day where you don't show up is part of what allows you to show up fully the next time you're there, is a huge, huge part of like feeling seen and cared for. And I'm not overextending myself. And the community I've built, because they understand me and I've let them know me, they are invested in that as well. And it also, creates space for other people to bring their needs in. And so, I have community and friendship. I became a grandmother last year, and my oldest had a baby. And I would say at least 3/4 of the people that showed up for the baby shower were movement people, and watching all these people come with gifts, and my my son was like, who are these people? Because he's an adult, he doesn't live with me. He's just like, but they're so glad. They were like, oh my gosh, we got all these lovely gifts, like surrounded in love, all these people, calling themselves auntie and uncle, and like, to this baby, because that is part of the work and part of the community we've built. And I just felt so, it was so lovely to see my children surrounded in this love, because these people love me and I love them, and to see my grandchild surrounded in this love, and it's just kind of, like my brother has a show. There's going to be a whole, row of kafias out there in the audience of people that, I've been doing movement work with that, want to support family. I love going to things, and watching what other people are doing. And I love, going on walks with some of the people that, I've been planning actions with and, marching with. And, it's nice to sometimes just go on a casual walk where someone isn't on a blowhorn, yelling slogans at you. And it feels really lovely, like to have that kind of community, um, and to not feel like you're going to suddenly be shocked. It's a community built deeply on shared morals and ethics and a vision for the future. And that does make it safer. And because we are close, because we actually care about each other, no one is sacrificed to the work. We don't make a decision that anyone's disposable. We don't make a decision that it's okay for any of us to burn out. We all check on each other and care for each other. And it just feels nice to have that kind of feeling of family. It's the first time I've honestly experienced it in my life.
Yeah, well, we just want to say thank you for being so generous with your time today. Also, I know, like me, you are an atheist, but I kept saying amen. I don't know how many times in this conversation. Um, the Substack is behind the book. Ijeoma, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely to talk with you.
It was such a treasure. Thank you.
Nora, I have to say, every single week I say this, and I know I'm becoming a broken record, but my God, that was a really inspiring conversation, I gotta say.
I was coming in with a different 8 ounces of joy for today, but I think this one is mine. Like,
I
I feel like I got so much wisdom from just sitting here and taking it in.
Yeah, when she talked about faith and having, because she, like me, is an atheist, having faith in humanity, there was a moment I was like, sometimes I think it takes more faith to have faith in humanity than it does in like some deity these days. But if her faith isn't shaken, then I suppose mine is shouldn't be either. So
Yeah, and just it's I think it's such an incredibly difficult thing to go through, what she went through with kind of community divisiveness and
yeah.
pushback, and to come out of it and say, "I'm gonna double down on my trust and my investment in community and my finding of joy and my ability to love people," and, like, that is just so inspiring, and not something that many people are able to do.
No, and she provided a great model of it for all of us, and so I hope our listeners take that to heed. Um, that being said, Nora, what is your as we move on to our 8 ounces of joy, what is your I know you alluded to, but what is your official 8 ounces of joy
My
this morning?
official 8 ounces of joy today, is Ijeoma and the lessons. I feel like I'm gonna have to go back to this episode and write a bunch of, like, inspirational notes for myself to, like, put
Yes.
around my computer screen and hold on to, but no, truly, I feel like I learned so much from this conversation. I'm gonna be really savoring it for a while.
No, same, same. I will say this, that is definitely an 8 ounces of joy. Hell, it's 88 ounces. It was tremendous. But my 8 ounces of joy this week was I got a phone call from my friend Paul Benz. He's a chaplain at Swedish Hospital, and he left a message. I didn't get a chance to pick it up, but it was one of the more it's one of the sweetest messages I think I've ever heard in
Hmm.
terms of he told me that an 81-year-old patient of his passed away, and before he passed on, he had taken inspiration from some of the words I wrote about my Minneapolis trip, and
Oh.
they really just helped soothed him
Oh,
you know,
Marcus.
as he breathes his final breaths. And so that's just it's just extremely humbling to hear that too. Yeah, I will say as a somebody who's a writer who many times wonders if you're just throwing, if you're just shouting, at at the rain here or whatever, or at the storms, and or if you're, throwing your words are just nothing more than you're throwing a bottle into the ocean, and hopefully somebody will find them. It's just also a good reminder that for writers and journalists out there who I know at times feel demoralized just because of the environment we sort of live in at these days, what you do matters. And so it was a great reminder. And I just want to thank Paul for sharing that with me. And so,
Mm.
yeah.
I can't think of a lovelier or more deserved tribute to your work. Um,
Oh, thank you, Nora. Thank you.
I mean, it's also a nice reminder, like, tell your writer friends when you like what they wrote because
Yes. Yes. Don't be a friend, a
they
mentor
need
of
it
mine.
right now.
Yes. A mentor of mine calls it the silent majority, like the people who like your
Yeah.
work but they'll just put it down and go on with their day. Like you can just feel free if you have the time, just take 10 seconds, text or put a nice little note on their comments section. Um that being said though, Nora, shall we go ahead and sign off for
We
today?
shall. Folks, the world might be on fire, but hopefully today's episode gave you a small little fire extinguisher for your particular patch of this blue marble. If you'd like to support the show and help us continue converting national chaos into digestible podcast sized portions, head over to inthemeanwhilepodcast.com. Your contributions fund the very important work of turning our raised eyebrows into sometimes structured sentences.
Yes, an immense thanks again to Ijeoma Oluo for joining us with the kind of hope that actually has teeth, the kind that makes you believe a better world isn't just possible, it might even show up on time. And look, I know Ijeoma doesn't believe in God, but damn it, after this conversation, we certainly believe in her.
Amen. And a huge thanks to our producer, Jessica Partnow, who somehow listens to us wander through our existential dread in real time and then edits it into something that sounds like we know what the hell we were talking about.
Oh, yeah. And also a shout out to Aham Aluo, who happens to be today's guest brother. For music that convinces people this show is much cooler than two people talking about democracy's emotional support system has any right to be.
You can catch In the Meanwhile Wednesdays at 5 on KVRU or wherever you stream podcasts while pretending the news cycle isn't just a billionaire's midlife crisis.
And new episodes drop every single Friday. Until then, hydrate, go online deliberately, and remember that gathering with other humans is still one of the best things you can do for your mental health.
Take care of yourselves and each other. And until next time, we'll see you in the meanwhile.